In this idyllic alpine land, the cowbells clink merrily on sun-dappled meadows and precision timepieces mark the passing hours with orderly efficiency. But beneath the placid surface, a struggle over national identity is unfolding. The spark for the simmering conflict? A modest proposal from the upstart youth wing of the center-left Social Democrats to raise inheritance taxes on the ultra-rich to a whopping 50% rate on estates above 50 million Swiss francs. To the causal observer in this prosperous nation, where discretion about one's financial affairs is sacrosanct, it might seem like a rather parochial debate over a seemingly arcane matter of tax policy. But for those steeped in the traditions that have made 21st-century Switzerland into a global hub for private banking and wealth management, this inheritance tax trial balloon represents nothing less than an assault on the nation's very essence. The initiative is damaging Switzerland's reputation as a prudent, considered, and business-friendly country, laments Tito Tetamanti, a prominent businessman and investor. We have lost a piece of our trustworthiness. For the better part of a century, the discreet Alpine Confederacy has cultivated an aura of solidity, probity, and restraint that has proven irresistible to the world's richest individuals seeking a discreet home for their fortunes. With its strict tradition of banking secrecy, low taxes, and studious neutrality in global affairs, this nation of 8.6 million souls became the indispensable vault for billions upon billions in assets belonging to the planetary elite. Now that carefully curated reputation is being called into question by the intrepid activists of the Young Socialists, or JUSO, short for the German Jungsozialist. These idealistic youths have the temerity to question why the ultra-wealthy aristocracy that lords over the 21st century global economy should be allowed to perpetually avoid contributing their full share to the commonweal. The richest class benefits from the economic system that caused the climate crisis, declares JUSO President Mirjam Hostetman. They should pay more to combat the consequences, not always society as a whole. Her provocative words have electrified the polite discourse typically found in Swiss salons and mountain chalets. For the nation's Übermenschen, those Nietzschean lords of global capital, the prospect of finally being forced to pony up represents a sort of psychological Berlin Wall crumbling down upon their cantonal redoubts. The sturdy bourgeois virtues that propelled the diminutive republic's ascent as an export powerhouse and epicenter of discretionary wealth management appear to be eroding in favor of more egalitarian, some might say confiscatory, sentiments. Even the very idea of flirting with such a draconian levy on generational fortunes being passed down has sent shudders through the ranks of Switzerland's moneyed elite. Take for example Tord Kolstad, a real estate baron who decamped from high-tax Norway to relocate in Switzerland just 2 years ago. The 42-year-old multimillionaire thought he had finally found a permanent tax haven after departing his Scandinavian homeland. But the JUSO upstarts seemed determined to follow him like Bergman-esque phantoms. It was a very radical proposal, and of course I think it would have a negative impact on a lot of business owners, frets Kolstad. Even though I'm very happy in Switzerland, I would have to reconsider if this goes through. Kolstad is just one of 22 members of the Global Plutocrat Club, as ranked by the Bloomberg Billionaires Index, who currently call Switzerland home. Many more millionaires and centimillionaires have been lured to parking their wealth here by the promise of security, discretion, and light taxation. Now their hallowed status appears threatened by what may seem to outsiders as a rather modest proposal to have the uber-wealthy pay an inheritance levy of just 50% on any estates above that 50 million franc line. But in the cosmopolitan realm they inhabit, even that is unacceptable. Isabel Martinez, a senior economist at the prestigious KOF Swiss Economic Institute, calculates that there are only about 2,500 taxpayers possessing a net worth in excess of that 50 million franc threshold. Yet this tiny sliver, representing less than 0.1% of all taxpayers, contributes a whopping 5 to 7 billion francs annually to government coffers from income, profit, and capital gains taxes. That's upwards of 6% of the revenue stream for the fisc. So the fear among the plutocratic ranks is palpable that this inheritance tax trial balloon, if allowed to proceed to an actual national referendum, could precipitate a wealth migration to other redoubts like Italy, the United Arab Emirates, Singapore, or even a post-Brexit United Kingdom that is actively courting global capital with enticing tax lures. The moneyed grandees are marshalling their forces, appearing frequently in the media to denounce the inheritance tax proposal as a step too far. They warn, ominously, that heirs could be compelled to sell off prized assets and businesses to pay the levy, resulting in a loss of precious jobs and economic activity as ownership shifts to foreign buyers. Besides, critics point out, The move could prove fiscally self-defeating by prompting an exodus of wealth that would need to be offset by raising taxes on, well, everybody else. Stefan Legge, a tax policy expert at the University of St. Gallen, minces no words. People with serious wealth will never pay this. They will just move. Even the JUSO activists concede their bid is a long shot, a mere opening salvo in a broader struggle over how to fund the generous social safety net and services in an aging, high-cost society. But already the reputational hits are piling up for a nation that has long prized its sober rectitude. The prospect of an inheritance tax inquisition targeting its wealthiest denizens strikes at the heart of Switzerland's carefully conceived national brand as a prudent protector of capitals rather than a redistributionist cudgel wielder. For many in the moneyed set, this represents a reckoning long in the making, the byproduct of rising economic inequality, climate change pressures, and the eroding trust in the very institutions that facilitated global capital's awesome 21st century ascent. A sort of burning yeoman resentment against the entrenched aristocracy of wealth appears to be smoldering. As the world convulses from the pandemic's disruptions and soaring inflation shreds the value of wages and nest eggs, that free-floating populist ire stands to gain greater force. Even here, in the hallowed precinct of Judeo-Christian capital, the reckoning seems unavoidable. The Rockies may crumble, Gibraltar may tumble, but the stoic Swiss long took pride in being that eternal force, an immutable bastion of security for the world's mobiliaires. Now the Social Democrats and their reckless youth vanguard threaten to shake that marble colossus to its very core. Perhaps it was inevitable that the roiling resentments of the age would finally breach the gates of this sanctum sanctorum of private capital. The JUSO inheritors of the 1960s egalitarian zeal have planted their defiant banner in the rocky soil of patrimony and provoked a conflict with dynasties far more deeply rooted. As the world watches to see how this high-stakes showdown unfolds, the ramifications extend far beyond Swiss frontiers. For if the reactionary impulse proves ascendant even in these ostensibly modest proposals, it will signal that the fiery pitchforks of the populists pose a graver threat to globalized capital and its 21st century primacy than previously reckoned. For now, the passing parade goes on, with visitors still flocking to Lucerne and its medieval byways to gaze upon the legendary swans and bridges. The watchmakers' lathes still turn out their exquisite miniature machines to mark time's inexorable tick. And the numberless vaults beneath Zurich's immaculate streets still secure the encrypted data holding codes that represent billions upon billions in the concentrated wealth of nations. But stirring beneath that placid surface, an elemental force has been awakened, one that seeks nothing less than a reapportionment of postmodern capital's spoils. Whether the coming reckoning will end up a mere retailoring of inherited privilege or a more tectonic upheaval remains to be seen. For now, the inscrutable mask of Swiss rectitude betrays little of the inner turmoil brewing over this fundamental quaestio vexata of wealth, justice, and national identity. Yet peer more closely and the cracks in that implacable facade become apparent, foreshadowing potentially seismic shifts to come. Consider the latest indignity inflicted upon the Swiss financial establishment. The stunning collapse of 167-year-old Credit Suisse, one of the twin pillars of the Republic's globally preeminent banking sector. For over a century and a half, the green crosses of Credit Suisse represented Swiss economic might and financial acumen. Its burnished brand embodied the pristine competence and discretion that drew waves of capital from across the world to Switzerland's wealth management engines. Then came the searing meltdown of 2023, when jittery global investors finally lost faith, sparking a liquidity crunch that brought this titan low and forced an emergency rescue merger with crosstown rival UBS. Recriminations echoed from Zurich's Bahnhofstrasse to the ritziest clubs of St. Moritz over how such a proud exemplar of Swiss corporate excellence went so awry. The embarrassing spectacle called into question some of the essential precepts of Swiss financial stewardship that underpinned its status as the world's go-to private banking hegemon. Could the pillars of security and probity upon which offshore fortunes were formed really be depended upon in the harsher climate of the 2020s? These discomfiting developments compounded the reputational hits from earlier fiascos like the American legal crackdown against Swiss banking secrecy and major tax evasion scandals like those involving HSBC, UBS, and Credit Suisse itself in years past. The steady erosion of what made Switzerland a secure repository for ultra-private capital appeared to be accelerating. This collective crisis of institutional self-confidence collided with a deeper national soul-searching underway over the Republic's long-standing posture of perpetual neutrality. That sturdy orthodoxy came under tremendous strain in the face of Russia's unconscionable invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. After some hesitancy, the Swiss Executive Council eventually joined broader Western sanctions on Muscovy oligarchs enabling Putin's war machine. But this proved a psychologically wrenching about-face for a nation that enshrined neutrality in its very DNA as a survival mechanism since the 17th century. In the ensuing soul-searching, many began to question whether that deeply ingrained stance of non-committal neutrality remained viable in a world increasingly polarized between authoritarian revanchists and defenders of the liberal democratic order. The inviolable sanctity of discretion and secrecy, once such pillars of Swiss identity, faced urgent reevaluation. This reckoning over money, history, and values intensified further the national schism over how to remake the iconic Swiss package to meet the challenges of the 21st century. And into this cauldron of elite angst strode the upstart activists of the JUSO, seeking nothing less than a fundamental reordering of inherited privilege and a reapportioning of the bounty. While their brash proposal for an inheritance tax levy seeks to generate new revenues to address inequality and the escalating costs of an aging society, at its core it represents something more profound. For the very notion of extracting a pound of flesh from the dynastic fortunes that form the very nucleus of Swiss plutocracy cuts to the marrow of how this unique republic has constituted itself over the centuries. Can Switzerland's carefully cultivated role as secure repository for the liquid reserves of global capital coexist with more egalitarian impulses to level those towering pyramids of inherited wealth? That appears to be the fateful question this nation will be compelled to reckon with in the coming years. The long-simmering resentments reflected in the JUSO's populist tax crusade have found new energy from the economic dislocations caused by the pandemic and the deepening climate crisis. With each passing year, the burdens borne by workers, the yeoman public and ordinary taxpayers have swollen, while a rarefied global elite continued accruing levels of wealth unseen since the Gilded Age. So while the prospect of a 50% inheritance tax levy north of 50 million francs may strike some as a rather incremental impost, the symbolism it carries cuts far deeper. It bespeaks a fundamental reappraisal of the proper roles of nation, capital, and citizenry that this small but oversized entrepot of the world's restive billions can no longer avoid.